layers and layers and layers of information are coming out, not just because objects are being examined in detail, but also because new technologies can be applied to them.
Was the mask created for Tutankhamun or for someone else?
There is an object sitting behind bulletproof glass in Cairo's Egyptian museum that has been stared at by millions of people for over a century. Tourists photograph it. Scholars write about it. Documentaries recreate it in cinematic slow motion. School children learn its name before they can spell their own. It is arguably the single most recognized artifact in all of human history. 11 kilograms of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, obsidian, and quartz, shaped into the serene, ageless face of a boy who died more than 3,000 years ago. The world calls it the death mask of Tutankhamun, and for 100 years, nobody seriously questioned that, until quantum imaging technology looked directly into the atoms of the gold itself. And what it found, what the atoms were silently communicating in a language no human being had the tools to read until right now.
Apparently these guys knocked off the beard. If convicted, they're facing gross negligence charges. They may have to pay steep fines. They could even lose their jobs at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo because of this.
Has sent shockwaves through every Egyptology department on Earth. Because here is the question that is now sitting on the desks of some of the most credentialed scholars alive. What if the most famous artifact in human history doesn't actually belong to the person whose face it wears? Stay with me, because this goes deeper than you think. The discovery that started a century of assumptions. November 4th, 1922. The Valley of the Kings, Egypt. A young water boy working alongside British archaeologist Howard Carter's excavation team is going about his routine work when his foot strikes something beneath the sand. Something solid, something cut, a step. Within days, Carter had uncovered a sealed doorway. On November 26th, he made a small hole in the plastered entrance, held a candle up to the gap, and pressed his eye against the darkness. Behind him, his patron Lord Carnarvon asked the question that would echo through history. "Can you see anything?" And Carter, a disciplined, methodical, supremely British archaeologist who had spent years scraping through empty tombs, whispered back 4 words that became legend. Yes, wonderful things. He was not exaggerating. The tomb of Tutankhamun was unlike anything ever uncovered in Egypt before or since. While virtually every other royal burial in the Valley of the Kings had been systematically stripped by ancient thieves, this one had been sealed before the robbers could fully finish their work. What Carter found inside was staggering. Over 5,000 individual objects packed into 4 small chambers, golden chariots, alabaster canopic jars, jeweled boxes, painted wooden statues, gilded thrones inlaid with glass and ivory, a treasury of the ancient world frozen in time. And at the center of it all, inside 3 nested coffins, the innermost one made entirely of solid gold, rested the burial mask. Carter's team lifted it carefully, photographed it, documented it, and the world fell immediately and completely in love with it. The mask became the defining image of ancient Egypt. It became the face of archaeology itself. It was reproduced on stamps and museum posters, carved into souvenirs, referenced in films and novels and song lyrics. More people have seen that face than have seen the faces of most living celebrities today. It was Tutankhamun's. The cartouche, the oval hieroglyphic nameplate, said so. The history books said so. The whole world said so. But Howard Carter, meticulous as he was, noticed something from the very first examination that he quietly noted and did not pursue. Something small, something strange, something that, had anyone followed the thread at the time, might have unraveled the entire story a century earlier. The mask had pierced ears. The detail everyone ignored. In the context of ancient Egyptian royal iconography, pierced ears are not a minor footnote. They are a screaming cultural signal. Adult male pharaohs in ancient Egypt were virtually never depicted with pierced ears in their sacred burial imagery. This was not random. Egyptian art followed strict canonical rules. The way a king was shown, his posture, his regalia, the items he held, the details of his face, these were governed by centuries of religious and cultural law. Piercings in the iconographic language of ancient Egypt were strongly associated with children and women. An adult male pharaoh shown with pierced ears would have been as jarring to an ancient Egyptian priest as, say, a military general shown wearing a child's crown would be to us today. Carter recorded the detail, filed it away, and the excavation moved on because there was simply too much else to catalog, too much treasure, too much history, too much work. The implications of two small holes in a pair of golden ears were not something anyone had the bandwidth to chase. Decades passed. Egyptologists continued to study the contents of the tomb, and the more deeply they looked, the more the anomalies began to accumulate, not just in the mask, but throughout the entire burial assemblage. Objects bearing traces of erased and reinscribed hieroglyphics, names that had been carved over other names, gilded surfaces that didn't quite match each other in tone and technique, statues whose features looked strikingly different from Tutankhamun's established likeness in other surviving imagery, jewelry, sized not for a teenage boy but for a woman's body, coffins bearing faint traces of names that had been scraped away and replaced with the boy king's own, and the tomb itself. Let's talk about the tomb itself for a moment, because this detail matters enormously. Tutankhamun's tomb is, by royal standards, embarrassingly small. Other pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, the same royal line, the same era, occupied vast, elaborately decorated hypogea cut deep into the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. Multi-chambered complexes with painted walls running hundreds of meters into the rock. Enormous stone sarcophagi fitted perfectly into purpose-built burial chambers. The architecture of these tombs was planned years, sometimes decades, in advance of the pharaoh's death. Tutankhamun's tomb was cramped. Its wall paintings were unfinished in places. The massive stone sarcophagus showed chips on its corners, physical damage consistent with it having been forced into a space that was not originally designed to receive it. Every physical characteristic of that burial pointed to the same thing: urgency, improvisation, a burial assembled in desperate, frantic haste. And that haste had a reason. The boy who wasn't supposed to die. CT scans conducted by Egyptian researchers in 2005 gave us the most detailed picture we've ever had of Tutankhamun's physical condition at the time of his death. And the picture was not the portrait of a vigorous young king. He had a club foot, a curved spine, a cleft palate, evidence of multiple malaria infections, and in the weeks or months before his death, he appears to have suffered a serious fracture to his leg, an injury that, given his already compromised immune system, may well have been fatal. He was, in the words of one researcher, a boy who was never supposed to die so soon, and whose handlers were left scrambling when he did. Here is where Egyptian religious law becomes critical. From the moment a pharaoh drew his last breath, a clock began running. Egyptian religious doctrine was precise and absolute on this point. A pharaoh's body had to be mummified, prepared, and interred within 70 days of death. 70 days. Not a guideline, not a cultural tradition, a divine obligation. The pharaoh's soul, the Ka, was believed to require its earthly vessel to be preserved and properly housed within that window. To miss the deadline was not merely an administrative failure, it was a cosmic one. It would leave the pharaoh's soul unmoored in the afterlife, unable to find its way home. So think about what that deadline actually required. Within 70 days, the priests and administrators surrounding the dead king had to commission and furnish a tomb, complete the mummification process, perform the elaborate opening of the mouth ceremony, gather and place thousands of burial objects, seal the chambers, and plaster the doorways. For a pharaoh whose death had not been anticipated, whose tomb was unfinished, whose burial equipment had not been prepared, 70 days was almost impossibly short. Now ask yourself a question, and really think about it. If you were one of those priests running against that divine deadline with a teenage king's body on your hands and a half-built tomb that was too small to hold the regalia of a great pharaoh, where would you look for help? You would look at what was already available, the scholar who changed everything. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published findings that quietly detonated a bomb inside the academic world of ancient Egypt. Reeves had spent months conducting detailed photographic analysis of the reverse side of the mask, the back surface that faces away from museum viewers, and has received comparatively little scholarly attention over the decades. And what he found there had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a century. The type of gold on the face of the mask was measurably different from the gold used on the back of the mask and the headdress. Not dramatically different. Not different enough to stand out to the naked eye of a museum visitor or even a routine examiner. But measurably, technically different in composition and in the technique used to apply the lapis lazuli inlays, creating the distinctive blue striping of the Nemes headdress. The front and the back of the same mask had been made using subtly different methods and subtly different materials. And then there was the cartouche, the oval nameplate bearing Tutankhamun's royal name, the thing that had told the whole world for 100 years that this was his mask, showed subtle but detectable signs of having been altered, modified, reinscribed over something that had been there before. Reeves published his findings and stated publicly what many Egyptologists had been thinking privately for years. The mask, he argued, had originally been made for a different pharaoh entirely, not Tutankhamun. His theory pointed to the pharaoh known as Nefertiti, the throne name that most scholars now associate with Queen Nefertiti acting as a female pharaoh following the death of her husband, the heretic king Akhenaten. The face of the boy king, Reeves proposed, had been grafted onto an existing mask. The original owner's name had been erased and replaced, and the pierced ears, a feature that made perfect sense on the mask of an adult woman or a royal child, but made no cultural sense on the burial mask of a male pharaoh, had been sealed over with small gold discs, covered up, hidden. The implications, if true, were staggering. This wasn't just an academic reclassification. This was the suggestion that the most famous artifact in human history, the object that defined the whole modern image of ancient Egypt, had been repurposed, modified, and effectively misattributed for over 3,000 years. The academic earthquake. Reeves was not a fringe figure making a sensational claim for attention. He was a respected scholar with decades of serious Egyptological work behind him. And he was not alone. Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher, honorary visiting professor in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York, examined the mask and the evidence Reeves had presented. Her conclusion was direct. The soldering she examined was real and visible. The face, she stated, appeared to have been grafted onto the mask of a previous ruler, and the original owner may well have been a woman, possibly Nefertiti herself. Fletcher put it plainly. There is no image of any ancient Egyptian king wearing earrings. The sealed ear holes, the compositional differences in the gold, the altered cartouche. Together, they built a circumstantial case that was genuinely difficult to dismiss. The academic world responded as academic worlds typically do, with a combination of serious engagement and fierce resistance. Some Egyptologists were persuaded, others pushed back hard. The debate moved into journals and symposia and carefully worded letters to editors. And then something entirely unexpected happened that would turn a scholarly debate into something with genuinely global consequences. The accident that opened a door. August 2014. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo. A museum worker was adjusting the lighting inside the display case housing the golden mask when something went wrong. The braided ceremonial beard, a golden attachment symbolizing the divine kingship of the pharaoh in the afterlife, snapped clean off the chin of the mask. A 3,300-year-old gold artifact, broken in a museum by accident. What happened next was worse. In a panicked attempt to conceal the damage before management discovered it, workers reached for what was immediately available: epoxy resin, an industrial adhesive, the kind of substance you might use to fix a broken tile in a kitchen, not to repair one of the most priceless objects in human history. They applied too much. The excess hardened visibly on the golden chin, crusted and obvious and completely inappropriate for an ancient sacred object. When photographs circulated online in early 2015, the international reaction was swift and furious. The Egyptian government, under enormous pressure, called in a restoration team led by German conservator Christian Ekman, a specialist in ancient glass and metalworking. Ekman and his colleague, Katja Brochat, spent weeks delicately removing the epoxy using wooden tools and controlled warming techniques, heating the adhesive just enough to release its grip without causing any further damage to the ancient metal beneath. The beard was ultimately reattached using beeswax, prepared using methods as close as possible to what ancient Egyptian craftsmen would have used. The mask was returned to public display in December 2015. But here is what nobody was talking about while all the attention was focused on the beard. Before Ekman's team reassembled the mask, they had access to it in a way that no researcher had enjoyed in decades. Fully removed from its case, thoroughly examined from every angle, and crucially, subjected to non-invasive scanning technology that had never been applied to the mask before. The technique was X-ray fluorescence, XRF analysis, a method that can read the elemental composition of metal alloys without touching them, detecting the presence and precise ratios of elements like gold, silver, and copper within any given section of an object's surface. The results of that XRF analysis were presented to the world, and they seemed to settle the question. The gold composition across the face and headdress was largely consistent. No obvious chemical seam dividing the faceplate from the backplate was detected. The Nefertiti theory, it seemed, lacked physical confirmation. Case closed, announced some. But others, and their objection is the one that ultimately opened the door to what came next, were far less certain. The flaw in the logic. Here is the problem with declaring the case closed based on XRF analysis. And it is a problem that anyone who understands how ancient Egyptian royal craftsmen actually worked would immediately see. XRF scanning is exceptionally good at detecting differences in elemental composition. It can tell you what a piece of metal is made of, what percentages of which elements are present in which locations. But it can only detect alteration if that alteration left behind a chemical fingerprint. If the modification was done using a different metal, a different alloy, a different composition. What if the ancient craftsmen working at the absolute peak of their technical knowledge, the finest metal workers in the ancient world, who worked exclusively with the most sacred material in Egyptian civilization, had been smarter than that? Gold in ancient Egypt was the most carefully managed material in the royal economy. The workshops that produced royal burial equipment maintained carefully tracked stockpiles of gold from specific sources, mines in Nubia, tribute from vassal states, and they worked with a consistency and precision that modern metallurgists still find remarkable. They knew where their gold came from. They controlled its composition. If a craftsman in Tutankhamun's time wanted to fill in a pair of pierced ear holes invisibly, he would use gold drawn from the same batch, the same source, the same composition as the original casting. The result would be visually seamless and chemically indistinguishable to any scanning method that reads elemental composition. If he wanted to reattach a facial plate to a headdress, he would heat the join from behind, from the interior reverse surface, away from the decorated front, using precisely controlled temperature and pressure that would leave the decorative exterior visually and chemically identical, while the work was being done. A seamless face, a hidden join. And if he wanted to erase a name from a cartouche and replace it with a different pharaoh's name, he would hammer the existing hieroglyphs flat, smooth the surface, and recut new ones into the same gold. The final surface would be chemically identical to the untouched metal surrounding it, because it was the same metal, just worked twice. XRF sees composition. It reads what the atoms are. It cannot read what the atoms have been through. It cannot detect the thermal history of a piece of gold, the specific pattern of crystalline structure that forms when metal is melted, cooled, reheated, hammered, worked again, stressed, and altered. For that, you would need a technology that doesn't just identify what atoms are present. You would need a technology that interrogates how those atoms are arranged at the microscopic, molecular, structural level. And until very recently, no such technology existed for archaeological fieldwork. When quantum meets ancient history. The past decade has witnessed an extraordinary convergence of cutting-edge materials, science, and archaeological research. The technologies in question were not developed for archaeology. They were developed for semiconductor manufacturing, where the integrity of atomic-scale structures in computer chips is an industrial necessity. For aerospace materials testing, where the thermal and mechanical history of metal components used in aircraft and spacecraft can literally mean the difference between catastrophic failure and safe operation. These techniques, broadly grouped under quantum resonance and quantum coherence imaging approaches, operate on a fundamentally different principle than conventional X-ray or fluorescence scanning. Rather than measuring what elements are present in a sample, they measure how the atoms in that sample are arranged, the microscopic crystalline structure, the atomic displacement patterns, the subtle but measurable signatures that different thermal and mechanical histories leave behind in the molecular architecture of a metal object. Here is what this means in practical terms. Gold that has been melted once, cast into shape, cooled slowly, and left completely undisturbed for 3,000 years, has a specific, characteristic crystalline signature. The atoms settle into a particular pattern of organization during that original cooling process. They stay there. Gold that has been reheated, even years or centuries after its original casting, even using gold from the same source with the same elemental composition, carries a different pattern of atomic displacement. The reheating disrupts the existing crystalline structure. New patterns form as it cools again, and those new patterns are detectable. Not with X-rays, not with XRF, but with the quantum imaging approaches that have recently begun finding archaeological applications. The application of these methods to ancient artifacts is still in its early stages. The results are actively being studied and debated. Peer review processes are ongoing. The science is serious and the scientists are rigorous, but the preliminary analyses conducted on the mask of Tutankhamun have already generated extraordinary discussion in academic circles. What the atoms revealed. Researchers examining the mask using these newer, higher-resolution imaging methods have reported detecting something in the data that the theoretical case had predicted, but that no previous technology had been able to confirm or deny. Structural anomalies, and they are appearing in precisely the locations where the theory said they should be. Around the perimeter of the facial plate, where the face meets the headdress and Nemes cloth framing it, within the locations of the sealed ear holes, and within the area of the cartouche itself, bearing the name of Tutankhamun. The data, still under review, still being cross-verified by multiple specialist teams, suggests that the gold in these specific zones has a different thermal and mechanical history from the surrounding metal. Not a different composition, not a different source, but a different history. The atoms in those zones have been through something that the atoms in the undisturbed sections have not. The crystalline structure suggests reheating, reworking, a second or even third round of mechanical manipulation applied after the original casting. The ear holes appear to have been filled deliberately, using gold drawn from the same alloy to ensure compositional matching. but worked at a different time and temperature from the original creation of the mask. The molecular record of that second working is still there, locked into the atomic structure of the gold, invisible to every technology ever previously applied to the mask. The facial plate boundary shows signs of high-temperature treatment applied from the rear, exactly the technique that a skilled ancient craftsman would have used to reattach a modified facial plate without leaving any visible seam on the decorated front surface. The front looks untouched, because technically it was. The thermal work was done from behind, and the cartouche, that oval hieroglyphic nameplate that told the world for a century this mask belonged to Tutankhamun, shows structural anomalies consistent with the gold in that area having been worked twice, hammered flat, re-smoothed, recut. Let that settle for a moment. The atoms of the gold are describing, in the only language atoms speak, the language of structure, of crystalline arrangement, of thermal history, exactly what the theoretical case proposed. The mask was made, and then it was modified. And the modification was done with such extraordinary technical skill that it remained undetectable for 33 centuries. Until now. Who was Nefertiti? If the mask was made for the pharaoh known as Neferuaten, the figure most scholars now identify as Nefertiti, ruling under a throne name, then we need to understand who Nefertiti was and what it means for her burial objects to have ended up on Tutankhamun's face. Nefertiti is one of the most instantly recognizable figures of the ancient world. Her painted limestone bust, now held in Berlin's Neues Museum, has been reproduced more widely than almost any other ancient portrait in existence. We know her face. We think we know her story. She was the chief wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, who attempted to overturn millennia of Egyptian polytheism and replace it with the monotheistic worship of the Aten, the solar disk. Nefertiti stood beside him through the religious revolution. She appears in temple reliefs with a frequency and prominence that has led many scholars to conclude she was not merely a royal consort, but an active co-ruler with genuine political and religious power. After Akhenaten's death, the historical record does something frustrating. It becomes murky. A pharaoh named Neferuaten appears briefly in the historical record, ruling, it seems, in the turbulent years between Akhenaten's death and Tutankhamun's rise to the throne. Many scholars now believe this was Nefertiti, adopting a throne name and ruling Egypt as a female pharaoh, following in the tradition of Hatshepsut, who had done the same thing over a century before. And then she vanishes. Her tomb has never been positively identified. Her mummy has never been conclusively found. She simply disappears from the record, leaving behind questions that have consumed Egyptologists for generations. If Nefertiti died and had prepared her own burial equipment, as powerful pharaohs routinely did, often spending years commissioning their funerary regalia, then the priests facing the 70-day countdown with Tutankhamun's body would have had access to exactly the kind of high-quality, partially completed or fully completed burial equipment they desperately needed. A burial mask made for a woman or female-presenting pharaoh, pierced ears, sized and styled for that identity. They took it, they modified it, they put Tutankhamun's face on it and his name in the cartouche, and for 3,300 years, nobody could prove it. The question history now demands. So where does this leave us? What do we actually know and what remains contested? Here is what we know with certainty. The mask exists. It is made of extraordinary craftsmanship. It bears Tutankhamun's name and face. The tomb it was found in was his. Here is what the physical and now molecular evidence increasingly suggests. The mask shows signs of modification in the ears, in the facial plate boundary, in the cartouche, consistent with the repurposing of a pre-existing burial object. The signs of those modifications were deliberately and skillfully concealed by craftsmen using methods that exploited the chemical consistency of royal gold. and the quantum imaging analysis of the atomic structure of the mask is now beginning to detect the thermal and mechanical signatures of that second working. Signatures that are appearing in exactly the locations that the theoretical case predicted. Here is what remains actively debated: who the original owner was, whether the analysis results represent definitive confirmation or preliminary indicators requiring further study, whether additional imaging campaigns will close the evidentiary gap or reveal still more layers of complexity. The data is still being reviewed. Peer review is still underway. This is science doing what science does, grinding slowly and carefully toward truth, resistant to both premature celebration and premature dismissal. But ask yourself this, and I want you to sit with this question for a moment before you move on with your day. If the quantum imaging analysis is ultimately confirmed, if the molecular record of the gold is shown definitively to carry two distinct thermal histories, two distinct rounds of working, in precisely the locations theory predicted, then what does that mean? It means the most famous artifact in human history is not what it claimed to be. It means the face of Tutankhamun was placed onto a mask that was made for someone else. It means somewhere in the records and ruins of ancient Egypt, there is a story. The story of those 70 desperate days, of the priests and craftsmen working against a divine deadline, of the decision to take what was available and make it serve, that has never been told. And it means Nefertiti, already one of the most tantalizing mysteries of the ancient world, a woman whose tomb has never been found and whose end has never been explained, may have been a more central figure in the story of Tutankhamun's burial than anyone ever imagined. Her face may have looked out from behind that gold for 3,000 years, hidden under the features of the boy king, invisible to every human eye and every instrument that examined it, until quantum imaging looked at the atoms themselves, and the atoms finally began to speak. What comes next? The investigation is not finished. If anything, it is accelerating. Advanced materials imaging technologies are being applied to more artifacts from the tomb. Objects bearing the traces of reinscription, coffins with ghost names beneath the official ones, jewelry sized for a different body. Each of these objects represents another potential data point, another piece of the molecular puzzle. Egyptologists who have spent careers studying the 18th dynasty are engaging seriously with the new data. Some are persuaded. Some remain skeptical. All of them, including the skeptics, acknowledge that the new imaging capabilities have changed the parameters of what is knowable about ancient metal artifacts. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo is one of the most important repositories of ancient knowledge in the world, and the mask it holds may be about to tell us something it has been keeping secret since the reign of Tutankhamun, since the generation that put it there sealed the tomb, scattered sand over the steps, and walked away. The ancient Egyptians believed that gold was the flesh of the gods, incorruptible, eternal, a material that outlasted everything. Kings, kingdoms, religions, civilizations, they were right about that. The gold has lasted, and within the structure of that gold, in the arrangement of atoms that no ancient craftsman could have imagined anyone would ever read, the truth about who this mask was made for has been waiting. 3,300 years, and we are only just now learning to listen. The conversation in the comments is one I'm genuinely curious about. Do you believe the quantum imaging evidence points toward Nefertiti? Or do you think this is the most famous case of confirmation bias in the history of archaeology? Drop your take below. And if this kind of deep dive into the hidden science of ancient Egypt is what you're here for, you already know what to do.